I never believed silence could become terrifying until I rented Cabin 14 deep in the forests of northern Montana. The listing promised complete isolation, breathtaking mountain views, and no neighbors for miles. After months of exhausting work in Seattle, the idea sounded perfect. I wanted a place where my phone had no signal and nobody could interrupt me. The cabin stood alone beside a frozen lake surrounded by towering pine trees. Every afternoon, the forest looked peaceful beneath the golden sunlight. At night, however, the same trees became dark walls hiding impossible secrets. Even the wind seemed afraid to pass through them. The owner, an elderly woman named Martha, greeted me with an unusually serious expression. She handed me the keys and reminded me to keep every door locked after sunset. I assumed she was simply warning me about bears or mountain lions. Before driving away, she hesitated as though she wanted to say something else. Instead, she only wished me a pleasant stay. I watched her truck disappear down the narrow dirt road until the forest swallowed it completely. I had no idea that would be the last friendly face I would see. The first evening passed exactly as I had imagined. I cooked dinner over the small wood stove and listened to old jazz records I'd packed for the trip. Snow slowly drifted outside the windows like silent feathers falling from the sky. The cabin felt warm despite the freezing temperatures beyond its wooden walls. I poured myself a glass of bourbon and enjoyed the peaceful quiet. Every few minutes the fire cracked loudly inside the fireplace. The sounds were comforting rather than frightening. Around midnight, I stepped onto the porch to admire the stars. I'd never seen a sky so clear in my life. Thousands of stars stretched endlessly across the darkness above me. Not a single artificial light polluted the horizon. The cold air stung my lungs with every breath. I smiled, convinced I'd finally escaped the stress of city life. That feeling lasted until exactly 2:17 in the morning. A whistle floated through the trees. It wasn't loud, but it carried perfectly across the frozen forest. 3 simple notes echoed through the darkness before disappearing. I froze beside the bedroom window and listened carefully. Nothing followed. I waited another minute, expecting another sound, but only silence answered me. I checked my phone and noticed the time without thinking much about it. The melody sounded strangely familiar, although I couldn't remember where I'd heard it before. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a bird or perhaps the wind passing through broken branches. I crawled back into bed and closed my eyes. Sleep returned surprisingly quickly. By sunrise, the strange whistle already felt like a dream. I never mentioned it to anyone because it seemed too insignificant. Looking back now, I wish I'd left that very morning. The second day was colder than the first. Thin clouds covered the mountains and the lake began freezing over completely. I spent most of the afternoon hiking nearby trails with my camera. Surprisingly, I found almost no signs of wildlife. There were no birds singing in the trees, no squirrels jumping between branches. Even the usual deer tracks were missing from the snow. The forest felt strangely empty despite its enormous size. As sunset approached, an uncomfortable feeling settled in my stomach. It wasn't fear exactly, it felt more like the certainty that someone had been watching me all day. Every time I turned around, nothing stood behind me, yet I couldn't shake the sensation. I hurried back to the cabin before darkness fully arrived. That night I stayed awake on purpose. I wanted to hear the whistle again and prove it had a simple explanation. I made coffee even though it was nearly midnight. The fireplace burned brightly while shadows danced across the wooden walls. My eyes remained fixed on the digital clock beside the bed. 2:15, 2:16. Then, as though someone had been waiting for the exact second, the whistle returned. 3 identical notes drifted through the frozen air. They sounded closer than the previous night. This time I walked directly to the front window. The moon illuminated the snow well enough that I should have seen anyone standing outside. There was nothing there, only endless trees stretching into darkness. Then another whistle came from behind the cabin instead of the front.
I didn't sleep for the rest of the night.
Every creak in the cabin sounded like footsteps circling just beyond the walls. I kept the fireplace burning until the room became uncomfortably warm. The poker remained clutched tightly in my hands. Just before sunrise, the knocking finally stopped. The silence that followed felt unnatural rather than peaceful. When daylight spilled through the windows, I cautiously unlocked the front door. The rain had ended, leaving the ground damp and covered with scattered pine needles. Fresh footprints surrounded the cabin in a perfect circle. They were barefoot, despite the freezing temperature. Each print looked unusually long, with thin toes pressed deeply into the mud. The trail completed one final loop before disappearing at the edge of the forest. I searched for any sign of where the tracks continued, but they simply ended. It looked as though whatever made them had stepped into empty air. I decided to drive into the nearest town for answers. The road wound through miles of dense forest before reaching a tiny community with fewer than 200 residents. The town looked forgotten by time, with weathered buildings and faded storefronts. I stopped at a small diner where only a handful of customers sat drinking coffee. The waitress noticed the address printed on my cabin key tag. Her cheerful expression faded the moment she read the number. She quietly poured my coffee without asking another question. An elderly man sitting at the counter slowly turned toward me. His face carried the weary look of someone who had survived things better left unspoken. Without introducing himself, he asked if I had already heard the whistling. I felt a chill spread through my body before I answered. Somehow, he already knew. The old man invited me to sit beside him. He introduced himself as Walter, a retired forest ranger who had spent 40 years working those mountains. According to him, strange disappearances had happened there long before the first cabins were built. Hunters occasionally vanished without leaving behind weapons or clothing. Campers reported hearing familiar voices calling their names from impossible distances. Search teams almost never found evidence explaining what happened. Walter leaned closer before lowering his voice. He told me the whistling never belonged to a person. It belonged to something that learned by listening. First, it copied sounds. Then it copied voices. Eventually, it copied people. Before I could ask what happened after that, Walter simply stared into his untouched coffee. I laughed nervously, hoping he was exaggerating an old local legend. Walter didn't smile. Instead, he reached into his jacket and placed a faded newspaper clipping on the counter. The headline described a missing photographer from 12 years earlier. The article explained that his camera had been discovered beside the frozen lake near Cabin 14. Every photograph remained intact except that last image. That last picture showed nothing but darkness between the trees. After staring for several seconds, I noticed two tiny reflections hidden in the shadows. They looked disturbingly similar to human eyes. Walter folded the clipping before I could examine it longer. He quietly said the photographer was never found. His voice remained calm, but his hands trembled slightly. Before leaving the diner, Walter gave me one final piece of advice. He told me to ignore every sound that came from outside after midnight. He warned me never to answer if I heard someone calling my name. Most importantly, he said I should never whistle back under any circumstances. I promised I wouldn't, although I still wasn't sure whether I believed him. On the drive back, dark clouds gathered over the mountains once again. Snow began falling so heavily that visibility dropped within minutes. The narrow road became almost impossible to see. Several fallen branches blocked sections of the path, forcing me to drive slowly. By the time I reached the cabin, the storm had become a blizzard. Leaving again would no longer be possible until morning. I realized I was trapped for another night. I grabbed the flashlight hanging beside the door and stepped outside despite every instinct telling me not to. Fresh snow covered the ground in an untouched white blanket. My own footprints became the only marks visible beneath the moonlight. I slowly circled the cabin while sweeping the flashlight between the trees. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, nothing reflected the beam of light back toward me. The silence felt heavier than before. Then I noticed something impossible. A fresh set of footprints appeared only a few feet ahead of me. They had not been there seconds earlier. They continued into the forest before suddenly ending in the middle of the clearing. There were no return tracks. Whatever had made them had simply vanished. The following afternoon, Martha returned to refill the propane tank. I casually asked if anyone else lived nearby. Her smile disappeared immediately. She asked whether I had heard anything unusual during the night. I mentioned the whistle and expected her to laugh. Instead, she became completely silent. Her hands trembled slightly as she tightened the tank valve. Finally, she looked toward the forest instead of at me. "If you hear 3 whistles," she whispered, "don't answer them." I asked what she meant. She shook her head. Some questions keep people alive because they never learn the answers. Before I could stop her, she climbed into her truck and drove away without another word. I watched the dust settle behind her tires and realized I suddenly felt very alone. Rain replaced the snow that evening, covering the roof with a constant tapping sound. The weather forecast warned of a severe winter storm arriving overnight. I considered leaving early the next morning before the roads became dangerous. To distract myself, I read an old mystery novel beside the fireplace. Around midnight, the lights flickered twice. The power returned immediately, but the cabin felt colder afterward. My radio produced nothing except static. Even the fireplace seemed quieter than before. I checked every window to make sure they were locked. While closing the kitchen curtains, I thought I saw someone standing between 2 pine trees. When I looked again, the figure had disappeared. I told myself exhaustion was playing tricks on my eyes. Deep inside, I knew I didn't believe that explanation. At exactly 2:17, the whistle returned for the 3rd consecutive night. It sounded so close that I instinctively stepped away from the window. 3 notes echoed through the rain before complete silence followed. Then another whistle answered from the opposite side of the cabin. A 3rd came from somewhere near the lake. They were surrounding me. Slowly, the whistles began repeating the same melody in different directions. It felt less like random sounds and more like communication. My heartbeat became so loud I could barely hear anything else. Then, without warning, every whistle stopped at once. The silence that followed felt even more frightening. I realized I had been holding my breath for several seconds. Something outside had decided to wait. A single knock echoed against the front door. It was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. 3 knocks followed on the back wall before I could even reach the hallway. Then another series came from the bedroom window. Whatever stood outside moved impossibly fast around the cabin. I grabbed the heavy fireplace poker as my only weapon. My hand shook so violently I nearly dropped it. The knocking continued in a perfect circle around the building. Suddenly it stopped. For several long seconds there was nothing except the sound of rain falling onto the roof. Then I heard someone outside softly whistle the exact tune I had been humming while making coffee earlier that evening. I had never sung it aloud. I had only hummed it to myself. At that moment, I understood the thing outside wasn't trying to scare me anymore. It was learning me. The storm intensified after sunset. Powerful winds shook the cabin hard enough to rattle every window. Snow struck the glass like handfuls of tiny stones. I checked my emergency supplies and discovered enough food to last several days. That should have been reassuring, yet it only reminded me how isolated I truly was. My phone still showed no signal. The battery-powered radio offered nothing except static mixed with distant bursts of interference. I tried reading to distract myself, but my attention kept drifting toward the windows. Every few minutes I thought I saw movement outside. Whenever I looked directly at it, nothing remained. The feeling of being watched had returned stronger than ever. This time, it refused to leave. At exactly 2:17, the whistle echoed through the blizzard. The sound somehow cut through the roaring wind with impossible clarity. 3 familiar notes floated around the cabin. Then another whistle answered from the opposite direction. A third joined them moments later. Soon the forest filled with identical melodies surrounded me from every side. It sounded less like random whistles and more like a conversation taking place beyond the walls. Suddenly, all of them stopped at once. The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then I heard someone whisper my first name. The voice belonged to my late father, who had died almost 10 years earlier. Every word sounded exactly as I remembered. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. I knew it couldn't really be him. Still, hearing his voice stirred memories I hadn't thought about in years. He calmly asked me to come outside because he was cold. He sounded tired rather than frightening. For one dangerous moment, I almost reached for the door handle. Walter's warning flashed through my mind just in time. I stepped backward instead. The voice immediately stopped speaking. A low chuckle replaced it. It wasn't my father's laugh anymore. It was deeper, rougher, and filled with quiet satisfaction. Whatever stood outside knew it had almost succeeded. Minutes later, the electricity suddenly failed. The cabin fell into complete darkness except for the fading glow of the fireplace. I grabbed my flashlight, but it refused to turn on despite having fresh batteries. Even the radio died without explanation. The only sound remaining came from slow footsteps above me. They moved carefully across the roof from one end of the cabin to the other. The weight sounded too heavy to belong to any animal. Snow slid from the shingles as the unseen figure paced back and forth. Then the footsteps stopped directly over my bedroom. A long scrape followed, as though sharp fingers dragged slowly across the wooden roof. Dust drifted down from the ceiling. I realized something was directly above me. Without warning, 3 soft whistles came from inside the attic. I stared toward the ceiling, barely able to breathe. The attic had no outside entrance and had remained locked since I arrived. Another whistle echoed through the darkness, closer than before. Then I heard something crawling across the wooden beams overhead. It moved slowly, pausing every few seconds as if listening for me. I forced myself to remain perfectly still. The crawling stopped directly over the living room. A single piece of wood creaked under unexpected weight. Fine dust floated onto the floor in front of the fireplace. Then, from directly above my head, I heard my own voice quietly whisper, "I'm already inside." Every instinct told me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The blizzard outside had erased the road completely. If I left the cabin, I would likely freeze before sunrise. If I stayed, something above me was slowly learning how I sounded. I backed away from the fireplace without taking my eyes off the ceiling. The whisper never came again. Instead, the attic became unnaturally quiet. That silence frightened me more than the voice itself. It felt like the thing above me was waiting for a mistake. My breathing became shallow as I searched the room for anything that could be used as a weapon. The fireplace poker suddenly seemed far too small. For the first time in my life, I realized fear could make an entire room feel smaller. When dawn finally arrived, I climbed into the attic with a flashlight and a hammer. The wooden ladder groaned beneath every careful step. Dust covered every beam, suggesting no one had entered for years. Old boxes, broken furniture, and rolled-up blankets filled most of the cramped space. I slowly swept the flashlight across every corner. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. Then I noticed something unusual near the far wall. The dust had been disturbed by fresh handprints. They were long, narrow, and unmistakably human. Yet there were no footprints leading to them. It was as though someone had crawled across the ceiling instead of the floor. I climbed back down with more questions than answers. My appetite had completely disappeared, but I forced myself to eat something. Every survival article I'd ever read warned against making decisions while exhausted and hungry. The food tasted like cardboard. Even the hot coffee couldn't settle my nerves. I kept replaying the whisper in my mind. It had sounded exactly like me. Not almost like me, exactly like me. Every pause, every breath, every tiny imperfection had been perfect. The realization made my skin crawl. If I couldn't tell the difference, how could anyone else? That afternoon, I searched the cabin more carefully than before. Hidden inside an old kitchen drawer, I found a leather-bound journal covered in dust. Most of its pages were faded handwriting. The entries belonged to a man named Thomas who had rented the cabin nearly 15 years earlier. At first, the journal described peaceful hikes and beautiful sunsets. Then the tone slowly changed. He began writing about whistles outside his window every night. A week later, he claimed something had started copying his footsteps. The final pages became frantic and nearly impossible to read. His last complete sentence simply said, "It doesn't want my body anymore, it wants my place." I searched online for Thomas's name the moment my phone briefly caught a weak signal near the upstairs window. One article appeared almost immediately. Thomas had officially been listed as missing after a winter vacation in Montana. Search teams found his truck parked outside cabin 14 with the keys still inside. His family insisted he would never have disappeared voluntarily. Authorities believed he had wandered into the forest during a snowstorm. Reading those words sent a cold wave through my chest. The journal had never been mentioned, neither had the strange whistles. I carefully placed the notebook into my backpack. Somehow I knew I would need it later. The storm weakened slightly before sunset, but the forest remained eerily silent. No birds returned to the trees, no animals crossed the snow-covered ground. Even the wind seemed strangely cautious. I stood on the porch for only a minute before noticing something between the pines. A man appeared to be standing perfectly still about 50 yards away. He wore a dark winter coat and faced directly toward the cabin. I raised my hand expecting some kind of response. He didn't move, he didn't wave, he didn't even shift his weight. He simply watched. Then a curtain of blowing snow passed between us. When it cleared, he was gone. That evening, I locked every door, every window, and even pushed the kitchen table against the front entrance. I knew wooden walls wouldn't stop anything determined enough to enter, but doing something felt better than doing nothing. The fireplace filled the room with a warm orange glow. Shadows stretched across the walls as the flames flickered. I checked my watch repeatedly without realizing it. Midnight passed, then 1 o'clock, then 2. I almost believed the whistling had finally ended. At exactly 2:17, 3 familiar notes drifted gently through the chimney instead of the forest. The sound came from inside the cabin once again. Ash suddenly burst upward from the fireplace. Tiny sparks scattered across the wooden floor. I stumbled backward as something heavy shifted inside the chimney. It sounded like slow breathing mixed with scratching claws. The opening was far too narrow for a person. Even a large animal would struggle to fit. Yet the scraping continued, inch by inch, as though something was deliberately squeezing itself downward. I grabbed the fireplace shovel and stared into the dark opening. The scratching stopped instantly. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then two pale fingers slowly curled over the edge of the fireplace opening before disappearing just as quickly. I wasn't sure whether I had actually seen them or only wanted to believe I hadn't. The rest of the night passed without another sound. Morning revealed nothing unusual around the fireplace. There were no fingerprints in the ash, no claw marks on the bricks, no sign that anything had been there at all. I almost convinced myself exhaustion had caused me to hallucinate. Then I noticed something hanging beside the front door. My winter jacket had been moved from the coat rack. Inside one of its pockets rested a small pine cone covered in fresh snow. I had never picked it up. I had never even walked near that particular type of tree. Someone or something had placed it there while I was inside. As I held the pine cone in my hand, a folded piece of yellowed paper slipped onto the floor. I was certain it hadn't been inside my pocket before. The handwriting matched the journal I had found upstairs. Across the center of the page, Thomas had written only one warning. If it ever leaves you a gift, it already knows where you'll be tomorrow. I read the sentence 3 times before looking toward the window. Beyond the frozen lake, deep between the pine trees, I saw a lone figure standing motionless once again. This time it wasn't facing the cabin, it was facing me, and very slowly, without making a single sound, it raised one hand and beckoned me closer. I forced myself to look away from the figure, hoping it would disappear if I ignored it. When I looked back only a few seconds later, it had moved several yards closer to the lake. I hadn't seen it take a single step. The distance between us had simply become smaller. Its face remained hidden beneath the shadow of a dark hood. One arm still stretched toward me with an open hand. The invitation felt patient rather than threatening. Somehow that made it even more disturbing. My heartbeat echoed loudly in my ears as I closed the curtains. Even with the fabric drawn shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching from outside. I resisted the urge to peek through the window again. Some instincts deserve to be ignored. The remainder of the afternoon passed in uneasy silence. I reread Thomas's journal from beginning to end, searching for details I had overlooked. One sentence near the middle caught my attention. He wrote that the whistles always became louder after accepting a gift. At first, he had thought someone was leaving harmless objects to frighten him. Small stones, feathers, broken pine branches. Then the gifts became more personal. A photograph from his wallet, his favorite pocket knife. Finally, he found a wedding ring he had lost years before. According to Thomas, the thing in the forest never stole objects. It somehow found pieces of a person's past. That possibility terrified me more than anything else I'd experienced. As darkness settled over the mountains, I searched every room once more. I checked beneath the beds, inside the closets, and behind every piece of furniture. Nothing appeared out of place. The attic ladder remained closed exactly where I had left it. Still, the cabin no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by something that preferred not to be seen. The sensation followed me from room to room. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to find someone standing there. Instead, I found only silence and my own growing paranoia. I tried convincing myself that exhaustion was twisting ordinary events into nightmares. Deep down, I knew that explanation no longer fit the evidence. At 2:17, the whistle came again. This time there was only one. A single soft melody drifted through the trees before fading into the wind. I waited for another whistle to answer it, but none came. Instead, I heard footsteps crunching slowly across the snow outside the front porch. They stopped directly beyond the door. A long pause followed. Then 3 gentle knocks echoed through the cabin. Unlike the earlier nights, they sounded almost polite. Whoever or whatever stood outside wasn't trying to force its way in. It was waiting to be invited. I stepped closer to the peephole, but stopped just short of looking through it. Something told me that seeing what stood outside would change me forever. The knocking ended as suddenly as it had begun. A few moments later, another sound replaced it. Someone was humming the same old jazz tune I had played during my first evening at the cabin. It wasn't simply the melody that frightened me. The humming matched my own voice perfectly, right down to the slight crack that appeared whenever I reached the higher notes. I had never sung that song aloud. I had only hummed it while cooking dinner on the first night. Somehow, the thing outside had remembered every note. It wasn't just copying me anymore. It was preserving me. The thought settled into my mind with unbearable weight. I wondered how many other voices it still carried. Morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky. The storm had finally passed, leaving the forest frozen beneath fresh snow. I packed my belongings as quickly as possible. My only goal was to reach the highway before another storm trapped me again. The truck started on the first attempt, and relief washed over me. I drove slowly down the narrow road, watching carefully for fallen branches. After nearly 20 minutes, I rounded a familiar bend. My stomach tightened instantly. Cabin 14 stood directly ahead of me. Somehow I had driven in a complete circle without taking a single wrong turn. The same tire tracks I had left earlier ended exactly where they began. I tried again, choosing every intersection carefully. This time I watched the compass mounted on the dashboard. At first, everything seemed normal. Then the needle began spinning wildly without explanation. The forest around me looked identical in every direction. Every cluster of trees resembled the last. After another 20 minutes, I reached the cabin once more. My own footprints still marked the porch. Smoke still drifted from the chimney. I sat behind the steering wheel, unable to understand what had happened. It felt as though the forest had quietly folded in on itself. No matter which road I followed, it always brought me back. Panic replaced reason. I abandoned the truck and began walking downhill, believing I could eventually reach the main road on foot. For nearly an hour, I pushed through deep snow between towering pines. The trees seemed endless. Every direction looked exactly the same. Then I noticed fresh footprints ahead of me. They matched my boots perfectly. At first, I assumed they were my own tracks. Then I realized something impossible. The footprints were approaching me, not leading away. Someone wearing my exact boots had been walking toward me from deeper within the forest, yet I had never been there before. The tracks ended in a small clearing beside a frozen creek. Standing at its center was an old wooden sign nearly buried beneath snow. Most of the paint had faded away, but one word remained clearly visible: return. Beneath it lay dozens of weathered objects half covered by ice: broken cameras, rusted camping gear, children's toys, torn backpacks. I recognized one item immediately. It was the same model of camera described in the newspaper article about Thomas. My pulse quickened as I scanned the clearing. None of those belongings looked recently abandoned. They looked carefully collected, as though someone had been building a quiet museum of people who never left. A whistle echoed behind me. I turned so quickly that I nearly slipped on the ice. No one stood there. The clearing remained completely empty. Then the whistle came again, this time from directly ahead. It was followed by another from my left, another from my right. 4 identical melodies surrounded me without revealing their source. I backed away until my shoulders struck the old wooden sign. The forest fell silent once more. Out of that silence came a single voice. It was my own, calm and unmistakable. "You found what I left behind. Now come find what took your place." I ran without thinking. Every survival instinct I had screamed that remaining in the clearing for even another second would be a fatal mistake. Snow sprayed behind my boots as I pushed through the dense pines. Branches slapped against my face, leaving sharp, stinging cuts across my cheeks. I didn't dare look behind me. The voice that sounded exactly like mine continued calling from somewhere among the trees. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't chasing. It simply spoke with complete confidence that I would eventually stop running. That certainty frightened me more than anger ever could. My lungs burned from the freezing air. Then through the trees ahead, I saw the cabin again. The sight of Cabin 14 should have brought relief, but instead it filled me with dread. The front door stood wide open, even though I clearly remembered locking it before leaving. A trail of wet footprints led inside. They matched my boots perfectly. I followed them into the living room, gripping the fireplace poker until my knuckles turned white. The cabin was silent. Every room looked exactly as I'd left it. The only difference was the bedroom mirror. Someone had written 3 words across the fogged glass with a fingertip. "Look behind you." My heart nearly stopped. I refused to turn around. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut for several seconds before slowly facing the mirror again. The message had vanished. I searched the cabin one final time. There was no one beneath the beds, inside the closets, or in the attic. The handprints in the attic had disappeared beneath a fresh layer of dust, as though they had never existed. Thomas's journal remained inside my backpack, exactly where I had placed it. I flipped to the final page once more. A sentence I was certain had not been there before now appeared beneath the last entry. The ink looked fresh. It read, "If you're reading this, it already knows you won't be believed." My hands trembled so violently that the journal slipped onto the floor. I no longer questioned whether something impossible was happening. I questioned whether I would survive long enough to tell anyone. Late that afternoon, the weather finally cleared. Sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. I climbed into the truck once again and followed the only road leading away from the cabin. This time the forest gradually thinned instead of closing around me. The familiar highway eventually appeared beyond the trees. I kept driving without looking back. Nearly 2 hours later, I reached the same small town where I had met Walter. Relief flooded through me as civilization returned. I rushed into the diner expecting to find him sitting at the counter. The waitress looked confused when I asked for him. She quietly told me Walter had passed away nearly 8 years earlier. At first, I assumed she had misunderstood. I described the old man in detail, including the gray jacket he had worn and the newspaper clipping he had shown me. Her face slowly lost all color. Without saying another word, she disappeared into the back office. She returned carrying an old framed photograph covered with dust. Several retired forest rangers stood smiling beside an aging pickup truck. Walter stood in the center of the group. He wore the same gray jacket, the same weathered hat, the same tired expression. I felt my stomach twist into a knot. The waitress quietly explained that everyone in town remembered Walter because he had spent years warning visitors to stay away from Cabin 14. I left Montana the very next morning and never spoke about the cabin again. Friends assumed my vacation had simply gone badly. Coworkers joked that I looked exhausted after spending time in the mountains. I laughed along because the truth sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. Weeks slowly turned into months. My sleep never fully returned. Every night I found myself waking at exactly 2:17 without setting an alarm. Sometimes I remained awake for hours afterward, staring into the darkness of my apartment. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, as though something had followed me home and was patiently waiting. One rainy evening I received an unmarked envelope in my mailbox. There was no return address and no postage stamp. Inside rested a single photograph. It showed Cabin 14 beneath fresh snowfall.
At first glance, the picture seemed ordinary. Then I noticed someone standing on the porch. The figure wore my winter coat. It stood with its back facing the camera. Slowly, I turned the photograph over. Written in neat handwriting were 6 simple words. "You left before we finished." My hands became ice cold. I had never told anyone about the cabin. From that night onward, strange things began happening inside my apartment. Objects appeared in places where I hadn't left them. The television occasionally switched on by itself at exactly 2:17 in the morning. My phone sometimes recorded short audio files without my knowledge. Each recording lasted only a few seconds. None contained voices. They contained only 3 slow whistles followed by silence. I changed phones twice, believing the first one had malfunctioned. The recordings continued appearing on every new device. Eventually, I stopped deleting them. I was afraid they might somehow come back louder. Months later, curiosity overcame fear. I played every recording one after another through a pair of headphones. At first, they sounded identical. Then I noticed something hidden beneath the final whistle in each file. It was an almost inaudible whisper. I increased the volume until the words became clear. The voice belonged to me. Calmly, it repeated the same sentence in every recording. "I'm getting closer." I removed the headphones so quickly that they crashed onto the floor. At that exact moment, 3 gentle knocks echoed from the inside of my bedroom closet. I never opened that closet. I moved out of the apartment the following day, leaving most of my belongings behind. Since then, I've lived in different cities under different addresses, never staying anywhere for very long. Yet every place eventually becomes familiar to the same quiet sound. 3 soft whistles drifting through the darkness at exactly 2:17 in the morning. Sometimes they come from outside my window, sometimes from the hallway, and sometimes from somewhere inside the room where I know I am completely alone. If you're hearing this story late at night, there's only one thing I want you to remember. If you ever hear 3 slow whistles outside your home, no matter how familiar they sound, don't whistle back.
As I tell this story, I still wake up at exactly 2:17 every morning. Sometimes I convince myself it was all caused by exhaustion, isolation, and fear. Then, on certain nights, when the world is completely silent, I hear those same 3 slow whistles drifting through the darkness outside my window. I never look outside anymore. I never answer, and I have never whistled back. Maybe Cabin 14 was only a place, or maybe it was never tied to the forest at all. Maybe it follows anyone who listens long enough. So tonight, before you turn off the lights, listen carefully. If the silence suddenly feels too quiet, if you hear 3 slow whistles somewhere outside, pretend you never heard them, because some things don't hunt by sight, they hunt by recognition, and once they learn your voice, they never forget it. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next terrifying tale. And before you go, tell me in the comments if you heard 3 mysterious whistles outside your home at 2:17 a.m., would you look outside?